It all started with a very simple idea: tell the stories of how successful middle market CEOs made it to the corner office. I'm Brant Handley, founder and managing director of Resource Options International, or ROI. We're the USA's premier executive search firm focused exclusively on empowering middle market companies to attract, hire, and retain A players while transforming top executives' careers and lives. ROI's Into the Corner office is dedicated to discovering how middle market CEOs advance their career, and we're making these remarkable and sometimes quite unbelievable stories available to you for the very first time. Listen and learn about the challenges they've overcome, the interesting people they've met along the way, and the lessons learned that steered these executives' unique journey into a middle market corner office of their own. I know you enjoy these CEO stories as much as I've enjoyed recording them, so thank you for listening today. And if you like what you've heard, rate us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm looking forward to you joining me on the next great middle market CEO adventure into the corner office. My guest today is Pat Philbin, President and CEO of Old Dominion Strategies. Pat is an experienced leader adept at building alliances and gaining cooperation with critical stakeholders on challenging organizational issues. He is results-driven with a demonstrated ability to acquire and manage scarce resources by leveraging partnerships and technology to resolve organizational challenges. Pat served more than 20 years in the U.S. Coast Guard, retiring as Chief of Public Affairs in 2004. He has extensive executive-level experience in leading, managing, and participating in large-scale, high-profile events, including the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger in the mid-1980s, mass migrations of Haitians and Cubans in the early 90s, the loss of TWA Flight 800 in Alaska Air, and the loss of JFK Jr.'s aircraft off of Martha's Vineyard, and dozens of other contentious and complex business and legislative issues associated with FEMA's transformational following Hurricane Katrina. Pat holds a doctorate in communication from the University of Maryland, a Master of Business Administration from George Mason University, a Master of Science in Public Relations from Syracuse University, and a Bachelor of Science in Government from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. Pat Philbin, welcome into the corner office.
Thanks, Brent. Glad to be here.
God, great to have you here. And where are we catching you this bright winter morning? We're kind of mid-December, getting into the holidays. Are you in warm climes, cold climes? You never know these days. You can't tell by location anymore.
You're right. I'm working out of a home office in Northern Virginia.
Nice.
So I've learned how to work virtually.
It's as we have all these last couple of years. And,
That's right.
I'm not sure the pandemic is all behind us, but certainly a lot of changes have been made over the years. And I'm sure we'll hear a little bit of that as we go through. But we always like to start our podcast at the beginning and focusing on kind of the early life of our guests. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. Mom and dad, where you grew up and what those early times were like.
Sure. So I grew up in South Georgia,
Mm.
a town called Albany. If you're from New York, I think they call it Albany, but I'm from
Right.
Albany, and fairly humble, very humble roots. My dad was a college librarian. My mom was a
Uh-huh.
public health nurse.
Wow.
I often joke English is a second language for me because I think the first time I left the state of Georgia, except to go down the panhandle of Florida, was when I went to college. So,
Right. Right.
um, since I spent my first 18 years there, and when I went off to college, never returned.
Yeah. Yeah. Brothers and sisters.
I do. I have a
Yeah.
younger
Yeah.
younger sister who's an
Right.
Irish twin. She's about
Yeah.
10 months younger than me,
Nice. Nice.
and a younger brother who's 5 years younger than me, and they live down south.
Mom and dad went to college. Were they, coming up through those, hollowed halls of education themselves, or what was their educational background?
Yeah, so my dad graduated, went to University of North Carolina, but I think he finished up at the University of South Carolina. And my mom went to a 2-year professional course in nursing. So she went into nursing. Back then they offered a 2-year, uh, I think it was a certification program in being a licensed practitioner. So that's what she did, and then went into the public health side of nursing. Uh, as I was growing up, so I had two parents working,
Yeah.
and pretty a little bit of a non-traditional in that Dad did all everything Mom did. They didn't have very defined roles, so I grew up uh, doing everything that traditional roles would have you think. You know, probably not. I did
So
everything,
dad
washing
would
the dishes.
prepare meals
He
and
did. Yeah,
wash
he
and help around
was
the house. Cool. That's awesome.
absolutely. So,
Yeah.
I find that to be a little bit abnormal talking to peers where their parents' roles were more traditional and mine weren't. Did a lot of camping,
Right.
which required a lot of support. Grew up around the water. My dad always had a boat.
Wow. Nice.
He had military service. I grew up with military and my
Yeah.
grandfather and all his siblings. So, uh, if you were on time, you were late.
Yeah. Right. Right. Get there ahead of time. What were some of the other memories you have from those early days? If you thought about some of the influences the parents and grandparents had on you.
Yeah, so spent a great deal of time with my dad's parents. He was an only child, strong military background. My grandfather was 30-year Marine and then went 10 years civil service with him. We
Wow.
did a lot of camping, a lot of
Yeah.
family time.
Yeah.
My dad walked away, I think, generally early from what I understand was a fairly promising golf career because it just took
Mm.
too much time away from the
Right.
family. And he was very committed to us. We camped almost every weekend.
Nice.
Did a lot
And it
of
was mostly
fishing.
in the Georgia area. I mean, where would you go? Is it in the mountain regions or down the coastline or
We
a
went
little bit of both?
everywhere from the North Georgia mountain
Yeah.
regions to all the way down to the Florida Keys at times, but spent a
Wow.
lot of
Wow.
time down in the panhandle of Florida,
Yeah.
boating and
Beautiful
fishing.
down there. Like
Yeah,
Destin,
yes.
Pensacola, kind
In
of that
fact,
way.
yeah,
Yeah.
they retired to Niceville, which
Oh,
is right
nice.
near
I know where
Destin.
that
I
is.
learned how to ski right in Destin. Yep.
Fantastic. Were you a good student in school?
You know, yes, for the most part. I can't say that I always was.
Right.
I was an average student, I think, initially, and some of your questions sort of prompted me to think back. And I do remember transitioning. I went to parochial school up into
Right.
seventh grade,
Right.
and I begged my parents to allow me to go to public school because they had a football program. So
Yeah.
they let
Yeah.
me go. And the first year was a bit of a transition. And I think I realized at the time I could, I should do better. And some of it had to do, I think, with the folks, the peer group. So I realized if I was going to get anywhere, I needed to sort of hang around a different peer group. And by the
Right.
time I got
Right.
into the ninth grade, I had figured it out. I was in the Beta Club, Honor Society, and doing pretty well.
And found stuff you like to do. I mean, that's so
Yes,
often with kids, and they get in subjects that just have no affinity for, and yet we still force them through that stuff. And you think, gosh, what a waste of time.
you
You
know,
know. Yeah.
interesting comment you make because I think our educational system. I got a feel for this when we were over at Oxford.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Right.
and their system is really kind of interesting. The British system of by the time you get to college, you're essentially in a master's program. I mean,
That's
it
right.
really
They
whittles it down.
stream them very young, and it's really much across Europe. I had spent many years there as well growing up, and usually at the ripe age of 14 or 15, they're either streamed into trade schools or they're identified as further high school potential or going into the higher level of university. And at the time, I remember questioning in my 20s, thinking, "Gosh, that's making a decision so young." But then, why not? Because we're typically pretty formed by the time we're 7 or 8 years old anyway, and there's some validity to that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, our system is a little backwards.
Yeah.
We try and put a lot of energy into helping improve people's weaknesses.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have not found that to be very successful because, as my mom said, you can't push rope. Um, and
Smart,
she's
smart
right.
comment.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
if you play to people's strengths, they generally have a lot more fun and they do it much better.
absolutely, absolutely. So outside of school, what type of activities you pursue? You mentioned sports. Did you have a particular one you liked?
I did. I played football initially, but
Okay,
I gravitated eventually primarily to tennis.
okay.
My mom was a bit of a tomboy. She grew up fishing and playing
Right.
basketball and tennis, and won
Yeah.
state championships in those sports. So, and I never got
Wow.
big enough to deal with our line, which was like averaging 250. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not a huge guy. So
Right. Right.
I decided tennis was a bit safer for me, and I enjoyed it more. More importantly,
Love it. Any entrepreneurial things you did as a kid, Pat?
you know, not really.
Yeah.
I worked to make
Yep.
money,
Yep.
to figure out, to satisfy. I was in Boy Scouts, so
Oh yeah.
I did that till just under 14, and there was
Nice.
some wonderful leadership opportunities there, and had a great time. I enjoyed it. Melded well with my camping interests at home.
Right. Right.
But no, I did jobs because they gave me money.
Yeah. There you go. Help support things. Well,
Yeah.
let's talk about what happened after high school. 20 years in the Coast Guard, wonderful public service career. Now, did you go there right out of high school? Did you do some college beforehand? I know you obviously achieved many degrees afterwards, but just want to get that period of time after you finished high school.
Yeah, so I was able to take college courses as many students are today
Yeah.
when I was a senior
Oh,
in
okay.
high
Good.
school,
Right.
and the
Right.
fact that my dad was at the local junior college allowed me
Yeah.
to do that. So I had
Right.
some college experience, but it was sort of largely I I seem to recall it was largely on me to figure out how I was going to get to college.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so my dad said, "Well, you can come to junior college." I said,
Yeah.
"Great."
Figure it
I'll
out.
take
Yeah.
it.
Exactly. Right.
So then I started to apply to various institutions, and my family's military background led me
Yeah.
to, some of the service academies.
Right. Right.
And growing up a lot around the water, the Coast Guard was seemed very appealing to me.
Right.
So I
Right.
applied to Navy, West Point, and the Coast
Yeah.
Guard Academy.
Got it. Got
Did
it.
not get into Navy.
Okay.
I did get accepted at West Point,
Right.
and I'll never forget. But I wasn't terribly enamored with uh, with that. I'll never
Was your father, grandfather, Army, or were they
Marine.
Navy?
Most of them were Marines.
Marines. Okay, yeah, yeah. So the Navy thing,
So
yeah, yeah,
we were
yeah.
sitting watching a ball game or something, and I got a call from my congressman office asking me about West Point, and I hadn't quite figured. I hadn't been notified on the Coast Guard. I said thanks, but no thanks. And my dad's this is the kind of guy he was. Who was that? I said, oh, it's Congressman so and so's office, and they wanted to know if I wanted to go to West Point, and I said, thank you, no. And he goes, hmm, interesting. That's about all he said. I don't think he liked my
Understatement.
response,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah,
Well, what did
but
he say? I mean that's a pretty good response as a father. Okay, interesting.
yeah,
Yeah,
it
make
is,
your own choice.
and I think that's sort of we were allowed to express our opinions, I
Yeah,
guess, or
yeah.
make our own choices, but we had to live with the consequences.
Of course, of course. Well, 20 years in the Coast Guard sounds like it became a career, at least the first part of it. So
It was,
you
yeah,
started on patrol boats, right? I mean, how did you kind of enter? And tell us a little bit about, give us that thumbnail sketch of that career. First time I've
yes.
spoken to someone who'd spent that many years in the Coast Guard.
Oh,
Fabulous.
okay. So
Yeah.
a wonderful organization,
Yeah.
great culture.
Yeah.
Went to the Coast Guard Academy,
All right. Now, where's that?
and it's in New London, Connecticut.
Okay. Got it.
And it's the only military service academy that doesn't require a congressional appointment, so it's all
Okay.
competitively based.
Right. 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 Just
I
like any
joke,
college would be. Yeah. Right.
yeah. So I often joked I was the Georgia pick. I got lucky. So went up to New. First trip on a plane was going to Connecticut,
No kidding. Wild. Wild.
so I spent 4 years there.
Yeah.
Graduated, went to sea. Most when I was in most early most every academy graduate generally went to sea at that point, and
Right.
I really enjoyed going to sea.
Yeah.
I was a weapons
Yeah.
officer, and then the second tour, you screen for command, so it's based on recommendation of your supervisors, and within 2 years out of the academy, I was commanding officer of a patrol boat and doing a
Wow.
lot of work down
Wow.
off of Florida and in the Gulf, in the Caribbean area, uh, chasing drug runners, doing fisheries
Wow.
enforcement, search and rescue, and it was a lot of fun having that kind of freedom and independence
I can
and
imagine. Yeah. Yeah.
small
And yeah,
crew.
you spent time obviously in the beaches, in the areas, your camping trips and so forth. So you had some exposure. And had you spent all that time out on the water? Did you know how to, skipper a boat and have that kind of background as well before joining?
I did, but they certainly send
Upped
you
your
through.
game.
They did. You learn how to navigate using
Yeah.
celestial navigation. You learn how to
Right.
handle vessels, going through ship handling school, and all those things that I enjoyed doing as a youngster. I was doing as a job, which to me was just
Yeah.
terrific.
Yeah. Getting paid for it. How
Yeah,
awesome.
exactly. Yeah, it was. So I kind of fell
18,
into it.
20 years old. Yeah, I love it. I love it. So you advanced through the career and actually left as in the public affairs area, I think, right? Wasn't that your last job? And
I did.
was that a career path that you had kind of intended, or how does it work, in terms of advancement in the Coast Guard?
it wasn't necessarily what I intended, but
Okay.
on that patrol boat back in 1986, which was my beginning of my second year, you may recall something happened at the end of January
Ooh, that's right. Yeah.
with the
Yeah.
loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger. And
That's
one of
right.
the missions
Gosh,
that
yes.
I supported was security
Wow.
off of Cape Canaveral. So I
Wow.
actually, my patrol boat was the first one on scene. And so we
Oh
had
my
to
gosh.
take control of the initial search and rescue for that. And
Wow.
I think my first interaction with media was coming in. I was the first vessel from on scene
Mm.
bringing a bunch of debris in, and I looked out, and there were just hundreds of reporters, and
Oh my
I
gosh.
was like, okay, I'm not sure exactly. I had this young petty officer come up to me who was a public affairs specialist. Says, "You're going to do fine.
Mm.
Say what you know, no
Yeah.
more. It's okay to say you don't know, and just talk." So
Yeah.
I walked out and they asked me questions, and we have a really transparent, very forward leaning communication
Yeah.
policy
Right.
in the Coast Guard, and we always have, which is bad news doesn't get better with age, one. And
Right.
if you own it or have responsibility for it, then you can speak to it. So
Wow.
it doesn't get any more simple than that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that is something I've carried with me throughout my other businesses that I've supported or run.
Baptized in fire. Boy, the heavy heart that you must have had that day. So you were actually pulling up debris upon your on the boat to take it back in.
Yes, I was.
My
Yep.
goodness. Wow. Wow. Tough.
Didn't expect to be there,
Yeah,
but
right. Well,
but
that's part of the job, right? You know, you step up and do what you have to do to, not just keep our coast safe, but the safety of others, that might have their difficulties on the sea,
yep,
from the air to the sea.
absolutely.
Wow. So from there, you did some instructing as well along the way. Tell us about, kind of how your career progressed.
Out of that particular assignment, I went to Syracuse and got a master's degree in public relations. I
Oh, you
went
did
down.
that while at the Coast Guard. Got
I
it.
did, yes. So
Yeah,
that was the
great.
first degree I got, and that was
Outside.
they sent
Yeah,
me full time, and actually I
nice.
was there. Interesting. We just had the Pan Am. I mean the Lockerbie bomb maker arrested,
That's
and
right. Yeah,
I had just left Syracuse after that in
wow, the Lockerbie. Yeah, the Pan Am bombing. Yeah,
1988,
wow,
and went
wow.
down to New Orleans to serve as a sort of a district public affairs officer and dealt with a lot of fisheries issues and oil and gas issues that the Coast Guard regulates. From
So
there,
wait a minute, let me get this
yep,
straight. So you're a Coast Guard employee, you're getting
yes,
paid a full-time salary,
I
and
am.
then they pay for you to go to Syracuse for 2 years. You don't
Yep,
have Coast Guard responsibilities during that time, and you study
correct.
and get your master's degree.
I did. I had two young children at the time,
Oh
and
my
and
gosh.
and I had plenty of time to get my work done. It was really funny going to school with folks who just couldn't figure out how to get it all done. They had no
Right,
responsibilities.
right, right. No structure.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, if that doesn't say a lot about our United States government and the service opportunities that are there, God bless them, right? I mean, what a fabulous opportunity to do that while you're
Oh,
going,
absolutely.
while
Yes,
you're
it
while you're
was
serving our
terrific.
country. Yeah.
Yeah, so I went from there, Syracuse, went down to New Orleans, where I served as what they call a district public affairs officer,
Okay.
supporting the Gulf Coast. So I knew the Gulf Coast, so that was comfortable. And then after a couple of years there, I moved over to Mobile, Alabama, where I got a larger patrol boat, larger crew, larger area of responsibility, and
Yeah.
basically did the same thing. Newer vessel,
Wow.
which was kind of cool.
Yeah.
Um, Nothing significant other than we spent a lot of time in the very deep Gulf chasing drug runners
Right.
on
Right.
that tour. And then I went up to the Coast Guard Academy on faculty, where
Back to London. Yeah. New London. Yeah. Yeah.
I taught, and then I served as what they call as a TAC officer or company officer, which is
Yeah.
you have about 100, I think it's about 100 cadets assigned to you on the professional side. And because I had
Right.
a master's degree already, they let me teach over
Nice.
in the academic side, which was nice, and I was able to coach the tennis team. So I
Right.
had my
Right.
hands, had my fingers everywhere. I just had a great time. Took the kids in all the time, and it was a wonderful experience. Just
Yeah.
2 years
Terrific.
there, I got pulled out early, and then basically spent. I got pulled down to Washington D.C. well ahead
Right.
of my scheduled tour to take over chief of media because of my
Right.
background. They
Right.
didn't have
Right.
anybody qualified, so I thought I was going to retire up in Connecticut.
Yeah.
So did my wife, who's from Maine. She would have liked
Okay.
that,
Right.
but
Right.
needs of the service. So I
Yep.
left early.
You went where you had to go. Yeah.
And I arrived right in the middle of the mass migration of Haitians and Cuban migrants in the early 90s,
Wow.
1994,
Wow.
where I reported aboard, and 20 minutes later, I was over briefing folks at the Pentagon because we had
Yeah.
everybody involved. Spent 3 years. I got deployed as the exile of a larger ship, executive officer, which is the number
Hmm.
two.
Excellent. Yeah.
Um,
Hmm.
so normally operational, and then in the middle of my first patrol, I got a call from a guy named Admiral Jim Loy, who had been selected to be the commandant of the Coast Guard, and he asked if I would return to D.C. and become his
Hmm.
press assistant.
Wow.
So
Did you?
I
I
did
have to
that.
ask you, Pat. Did you ever think that back in '86, that tragic day when you were the first, literally man on the spot to come in and talk to public affairs, that might have had an influence on the direction of your career? That maybe, maybe that young petty officer put in some words every now and then about your ability to, meet the press, so to speak.
Well, it did. The fact that I didn't screw up didn't hurt.
Yeah, right. Sometimes that's all it takes, right?
It's full of landmines, as you and I
Yeah,
know
it is.
today, and
Absolutely.
it's fascinating
Yeah,
watching what's
yeah.
going on.
Right, right. Looking back at that arc of your career, those first 20 years, those formative years, what would you say are two or three of the leadership lessons you took away from that time?
Uh, so one I learned from Admiral Jim Loy, which was
Yeah.
preparation equals performance.
Hmm. So true.
I joke I never got a job I was qualified for. I heard that from somebody once before. I said, that's kind of right, but it forces you to learn,
That's right.
adapt,
Yeah.
and I'm insanely curious about most anything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
uh, if if you're familiar with psychographic testing like
Hmm.
strength
Sure.
finders, which we
Yes.
use in our
Yeah. Hmm.
companies or Colby, if you were to look at my resume and find out that I'm my I'm a learner, so that
Yeah.
is my
Yeah.
number one. And
Right.
if you saw me, you would go, does the guy ever not stop? No, because I'm fascinated by knowledge.
Three books
So
at your bedside table, right?
yeah, I
Reading new
just like
stuff all the
learning
time.
about the world. I'm
Right.
just
Right.
insanely curious about things,
Yeah.
which
Awesome.
has helped. So and so that's one lesson I think. I had a lot of things happen in my career. I not some not so great. I had a supervisor who committed suicide
Oh
when I
goodness.
was down in Washington, which was horrible. It was right around the time the chief of naval operations had done the same thing. So
Oh my gosh.
again, another issue, but resiliency is really important. And if you're the one in charge, you have to sort of compartmentalize any processing of that information.
You do.
You have a
Yeah. Yeah.
responsibility to your crew. So I think that's
Right.
the and then probably the third thing I learned on my first patrol boat, which was I had a senior enlisted individual who was in charge of the engineering department, which I had lost confidence in.
Hmm.
So I asked my superiors to please remove him and have him evaluated for competency. He was my roommate also.
Oh my gosh.
So
Hard. Hard
it was a
call.
little uncomfortable as a
Yeah.
22-year-old to go,
Sure.
you don't have, or 23, I guess I was 24.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have, in my opinion, what it takes to lead people.
Hmm.
So leadership is hard,
Yeah. It is. That's right.
but
It doesn't come
you owe
naturally.
it to those that you're leading to do the right thing
Yeah.
regardless.
Yeah, love it. Great stuff. All right, so back to my first question was making that shift. So did you fully retire? I know
Oh yes.
many, folks that leave at 20. And I got to tell you, as a recruiter, I love that first 20-year background because you get guys that are in their mid 40s. They typically have 80, 90% of their pension. So they're taken care of. They got their health care and everything else. And they're
Right.
so well trained. I mean, they've got the leadership, they've got the knowledge, they've got the discipline. I love placing them, regardless of where they are in their career. So were you kind of one of those guys? I mean, did they give you that option to retire with a full pension and all that kind of stuff, or
They
how did that
did,
work with the Coast Guard?
and
Yeah.
actually, the irony is, I put in my retirement letter the just before the morning the '06 assignment panel or selection panel came in. So I walked away from a promotion to '06.
Oh.
Um, uh, it didn't sit all that well with my family. But I think maybe then I knew I wanted to do
To do
something
something else.
different.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I love the Coast Guard. My classmate just retired last year as the
Oh.
commandant. I love the
Right. Right.
organization. It is wonderful. But I wanted to do something more and different.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I left, and then I went to work for a small security firm that was guarding critical infrastructure
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
for a short period before I got pulled up to do other things or invited to do other things. So I didn't have to leave, but I spent the last 10 years of my career basically working for flag officers, admirals,
Right. Right.
and they really had very little control of their time.
Interesting. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
system does it for you, really. I mean, we
Yeah.
have
Right.
policies and procedures and systems and all these support elements in large organizations like that, and you really have very little flexibility over
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
do when.
Right.
And
And so
that
that
wasn't me.
that was that kind of the, yeah, that was part of the motivation of looking on. And so what was that first CEO assignment that you had? Was it Subsidium? I know you founded another company, but
Yes.
tell,
I so I started Crisis1 back in 2007,
right,
and at
right,
the same time I established a board of advisors, and one of them was the an owner of a company called Subsidium
right,
out in Front Royal, and uh, I did so at the behest of my mentor, a guy named Larry Gaffey, who continues to serve as our CFO for our companies. Really sharp guy, very wise, and he just threw it out there because I had had an experience as a political appointee under the
ah,
Bush administration at
right,
FEMA that
right,
did
right,
not end well,
mm,
and I really didn't have too many options. What I did learn from that experience was uh, you can't leadership is generally in short supply. You don't find many people that'll take bullets for their crew.
right. It's
And
true.
I didn't
Yeah,
join because of my political connections, but my Coast Guard, abilities and where I
qualifications. Yeah,
demonstrated that. So I went in and led the external affairs effort after Katrina at FEMA.
right.
That was probably the most difficult job I've ever had. We were getting probably 1,000 inquiries a week, so I managed the relationships with the Hill, the White House, the department, and all the people who were mad at us. And there were a few.
Yeah, sure.
So
Thankless job.
it
Thankless
was.
job.
So
Yeah,
I from there I left public service and started Crisis1.
yeah,
Quite frankly,
yeah,
because of what happened. Again, things happen. So I learned there resilience is really important. Started
yeah.
Crisis1, had a couple of folks that were advising as board members, and one of them who owned 51% of another company was struggling. So I said, well, I'll do what I can because I had a have a service disabled status.
Right.
So I basically took over his company and I did a little bit of cleaning up. I had to go in and let some people go because they just weren't adding any value to that,
Got it. Yeah.
and then continue to work on my own to build Crisis1, which
So you're
was
doing both at the same time, Subsidium as well as Crisis One, right? Right.
correct.
Those
And
are
it was
overlapping. Yeah.
it's seldom an overnight success. I primarily do government consulting, which is
Right.
it's a the barrier to entry there is pretty high.
Yeah. Yeah.
So based on that experience, I I developed an interest in trying to help others avoid some of the mistakes I made through those
Right.
years. So
Right.
I started in 2007, more legitimately in 2009. But it wasn't until 2015 or 16 that I landed my first couple of contracts, and then they came. I think I won three of them in a span of
Yeah.
about 3 weeks.
Wow.
So it's tough breaking into that,
Yeah.
but once you get there,
Right. You
it's
establish the credibility and yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and
Well, tell us a
reputation.
little bit about, so what do you do? I mean, on Crisis One typically does have an, we kind of get the gestalt on that, but maybe you
Yep.
can give us a little bit more about, what kind of crises you're currently handling.
Yeah, so Crisis1 was the first company I started, and it was established primarily and initially to focus on crisis management, crisis
Right.
communication. But quite
Right.
frankly, my FEMA experience led me uh, to pursue other efforts only because I mean, I was just being pragmatic about it. One, there isn't a tremendous amount of money in communications
Hmm.
in the government sector, even though I've run a couple of agency public affairs shops. And
Right.
the other issue is my credibility was really called into question following what happened to me at FEMA. So I'm like, I got to just go do something different. So
Yeah.
I started looking at things like financial management systems, program management, project management. You can studies and analyses. These are things that are pretty standard in government contracting,
Right.
and so yeah, there are three legs to the stool in government contracting. One, you got to have the acquisition vehicles, and two, you got to have a competency, and three, you got to win the work.
Right.
So I realized pretty early on that if I didn't have prime contract vehicles, I would always be relegated to being a subcontractor. And if you
Mm.
don't have privacy of contract and be the prime, then you're always going to have to deal with people who are frequently not consistent with your own core values.
Got it. Yeah.
And so I said, look, unless I have to, I don't want to ever be a subcontractor.
Right.
And so
Right.
my focus has been, how do I win prime contract work
Yeah.
to make
Yeah.
sure that I don't have to sleep with one eye open at night?
Right, right. Good way of describing it. And how did you do that? Was it, did you leverage a lot of your contacts? Did you, really just go deeper with the type of people you wanted to work with? Did you have,
Yeah.
social media strategies that got you there?
So
How did how did that develop?
for somebody who has a PhD in communication, I hate social media, and
We're of
and
that age. Yeah.
well, yeah, but I also, because of what happened to me,
Yeah. Yeah.
I reflected on that. I was sort of like the canary in the coal mine,
Mm,
because I was accused of doing something that, quite frankly, I didn't do, and it
right.
cost me a career.
Oh,
Um,
gosh,
I
so bad.
I had an appointment over to DNI that they rescinded as a result of this. I had
Wow.
my university try and revoke my PhD because of things I was accused of doing, and
Gosh.
what struck me was people don't even know me. They didn't
Yeah.
ask me any questions. I had to fight
Right.
my way into some of the conversation, and then just to have a conversation about what happened. But it was sort of people in social media. A lot of researchers called it the wisdom of the crowds very
Mm,
early.
yeah.
When I was doing my PhD work, I was nervous about this because I said, no, we hang around others like ourselves,
Mm,
and that model only works if you're hanging around with people who are critical consumers of information
right.
and are have a sense of values and what's important and what's not, and willing to listen. What you
Yeah.
find, what I found through that experience was people don't care. They,
Mm.
if they didn't think, and mind you, who liked FEMA after Katrina? I don't know anybody.
No.
So I was tar and feathered. My first
Uh,
public event was like 2 weeks after I reported. I went back to my alma mater at Syracuse to take the stage on a presentation at Newhouse with a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer from the
mm,
Times Picayune. Now, if you think that wasn't a hostile crowd, it was.
wow.
But
Wow.
people didn't understand the mission or the staffing or any of that of the agency. I mean, they don't do things. They're the bank.
That's right.
They're
Yeah, they're
they're
there to
they're the
support.
framework,
Yeah,
and
right,
they didn't
right,
realize that the size of FEMA was smaller than some of the high schools in the area at Syracuse.
right, right. Goodness, hard, tough stuff. Well, out of those types of situations, we gain strength and knowledge.
We do.
If you were to say two or three of those key takeaways from that FEMA experience that you've applied to now what you're doing, what would those be?
So one was, I think some of these are repetitive. One is resilience is really important.
Yeah,
Know yourself.
right,
Know what
right.
your strengths are. Play to them. I gained a lot of. I have participated in an executive development program called Strategic Coach for
Hmm.
several years, and
Yeah,
Dan Sullivan, who founded that in the early '80s, my entire senior team goes to that.
great.
It is a it helps me put things in context, and it
Right.
helps provide intellectual property that helps us define where we're going and how we're going to get there and what we're going to do with our lives.
Yeah,
So that's the other thing, and one, to make a difference. I think
yeah.
make a difference in others' lives.
Hmm.
And I'm a believer in karma.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
it'll come back to you.
yeah. That's right. The good and the bad, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, it
Yeah.
will. Yeah,
So Old Dominion, you purchased about 5 years ago. Was
I
that,
did.
kind of a bolt-on strategy? Did they have a specific area of expertise that you were trying to get? What were the motivations behind that?
Yeah, it was more pragmatic. They had a
Yeah,
contract vehicle,
got it.
what we call a indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contract vehicle
Hmm.
that was relevant to the Department of Homeland Security called PAX 2. I
Okay.
tried to win that with Crisis 1. We did not. So
Right.
I faced the choice of the contracts I had under Crisis 1 were largely going to probably transition to PAX 2. So
Right.
if I wanted to be the prime contractor and compete for my own work, I needed to go
Got it.
acquire another company. Fortunately,
Other words, it would be more just transactional one offers, right? Versus
that's
with the PAX 2.
yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
correct. And
Got it. Got it.
I don't like transactionals.
Yeah. No.
But in this
Excellent.
case, they only had one or two small contracts, so
Right.
um, we bought it, and I'm happy to report that we paid off the previous
Yeah.
owners,
Excellent.
which was
That's
great.
good news.
It
Yeah.
was, and it was a really easy transaction because there
Yeah.
wasn't a whole lot there, so that's wonderful.
Right. Right.
We built on the name, and we do a lot of work under the current PAX 2
Yeah.
vehicle. I think we're
Yeah.
either number 2 or 3 in terms of revenue on that. And we've got
Wow.
probably 70 folks on that company, 75
Nice.
folks.
Nice.
So, and we do financial management, modernization, program management. We do some logistics type work. We do space. So I gravitate towards things that tend to be more transformational. How are we going to
Right.
help our client do something, make the ship go faster? That's sort of
All
one of the things
all
we work
government
on.
contracts, or do you do private sector as well in terms of
We have done
your
some
stuff?
private sector
Yeah.
work.
Yeah.
I had
The
a
bulk of it.
2 year stint after my FEMA, roughly 2 year stint, where I did some contract work for another company called Peer Systems. I don't
Okay.
think it's in business any longer, where
Yeah.
we sold services and technology in the crisis communication
Right.
space
Right.
to others. But I've done some consulting in pharmaceuticals and oil and gas. I mean, crisis management is crisis management.
Yeah. Right.
It's not
Right.
rocket science in my view. But
Well,
getting
you're
others absent a crisis to understand what they need to do is a little
yeah.
difficult.
Now choosing the right people to do this has got to be important. You're growing now. You're obviously doing some hiring. What
Yes.
are your thoughts on, when you're making bets on the people you want to invest in and hire? What do you look for?
Yeah. So one of the things we look at, and the older I get, the more important this becomes. I look for drivers,
Hmm.
but not just anybody who can drive. I'm a firm believer in looking for people who are humble, hungry, and smart. It's
Hmm.
it's sort of a model of it reflects my own view of humility. I check your ego at the door. Cy Wakeman produces some terrific stuff on this kind of issue, reality-based leadership. But the reality is, I look for people who not only are humble, hungry, and smart, but they get it, want it, and they can do it. So
Yeah.
that's really the criteria: is humble,
Right.
hungry, smart, get it, want it, and can do it.
Yeah.
And if we
Yeah.
can identify activities, I will tell you that I'm more interested in when I interview people what they do on the weekends than I am what they
Hmm.
do during the week, because that tells me
Interesting.
what they're passionate about,
Yeah. Yeah.
what
So
they
is that
like
what you
doing.
ask them? Is that a favorite interview question?
Oh yeah, yeah. I want to
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
don't tell me what you do to deliver something, because
Right.
I
Right.
can teach people generally, or we can get you training to solve an issue, a problem.
Right.
What
Right.
what I what we can't teach is what my wife and I joke about called homeschooling. Do they have initiative? Do they have the right
Right.
attitude? Do they
Right.
come from the right core
Are
values?
they curious?
Are
Are
they
they curious?
curious?
Yeah, to your
Absolutely.
point. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So for me at my level, I'm assuming when a person comes to me in the interview process, by the time they've hit me, they've checked all the technical
right,
requirements that the person
right,
can do the work.
right.
I'm more interested in the future. What do you
Yeah,
want to do tomorrow? How can I help you make your resume stronger tomorrow than it is today? And
right,
if I can
right.
do that, then the chances are we're going to keep you a long time. And
Yeah,
even if
yeah,
you go places, you're going to come back. And
yeah,
that's what we've
right.
seen. We have a retention rate
Partnering. Yeah.
well above 90%, which is pretty
Wow.
unheard of in the government space.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So
What
money's
about
necessary, but it's not
yeah.
sufficient.
No, no, absolutely. What about cultural fit? How do you kind of interview for that? What's your, kind of your litmus tests for that
So
type of
we have
evaluation?
we have a mission statement, which is make
Hmm.
success possible. So that
Okay.
means for our people, for our families, our communities, our clients. And so we look for demonstrated behaviors that would affirm their interest in helping others.
Yeah, yeah.
So that to me is an indicator. We created something called a Vivid Vision Award that
Hmm.
we hand out monetary awards to folks who we find that are not only doing the work, That's necessary. But what are you doing in your community? How are
Yeah.
you making lives better for others? And so
Yeah.
rather than own, I mean, I do it, but I think it's a very personal choice. If you're doing something good for another organization or an individual that's helping them grow, that to me is why we're here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I love
so
it.
it's a legacy issue for me. I'm not getting any younger, and to me, uh, if you can help somebody that has a bias to that, I can't push rope again, right? So I
Yeah,
can't
that's
want
right.
something more for others than they want for themselves. But
Yeah.
if I can find somebody who just needs a little help, I can see the attitude is there and the initiative and the drive and the motivation. I will take a chance, and
Yeah.
and we do.
Love it. That's great. Well, we're just about out of time, Pat. We always have one last question we ask all our guests, and that's what kind of life and career advice you'd give to someone that perhaps has their eyes on their own corner office someday.
I think always be humble.
Hmm.
Never,
Humble,
never.
hungry, and smart, right? Let's list all
Yeah,
three of those,
yeah, but
right?
never lose sight of what got you to where you got. In my
Yeah.
view, is I'm a huge believer in personal responsibility and accountability. Let's make better decisions. Let's 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 be let's focus on what you do really well. There's somebody out there that does what you don't do well really well. And I
Hmm.
love building high performing teams.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you may not have the full suite of things, but if you can contribute to a high performing team, I'm a firm believer that 1 and 1 can equal 11.
Yeah.
I'd much rather
I love
have
it.
an average group of performers. Give them to me any day
Yeah.
that have the right attitude and initiative and
Right.
motivation, because my observation, at least in the athletic realm, is you find teams that are loaded with superstars,
Yeah.
but they don't know how to check their ego at the door.
That's right.
So
The
get
prima
rid of the
donnas.
ego.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
I take
Right.
out trash. I talk to
Right.
people. Be nice to the janitor.
Yeah.
They have a
You
role
saw
to play.
your dad cooked you meals, right? I mean,
Right.
right?
I
You
know
grew
that
up in that
sounds really
environment.
simple, but
No, it's important. Yeah.
it
I love it.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So it's
Pat
not
Philbin.
technical.
Yeah.
It's just
Yeah.
it's just being human.
Being a good person, right? When it comes
Yes.
down to it. Well, Pat Philbin, President and CEO of Old Dominion Strategies, as well as President, CEO, and founder of Crisis1, thank you so very much for sharing your journey into the corner office.
Thank you very much for having me, Brent.
Thank you for listening to Into the Corner Office with Brant Hanley. We hope you enjoyed hearing our guest CEO story as much as we did. If you want to hear more CEOs reveal their journey into the corner office, please subscribe via iTunes and tell your friends and colleagues. For more information about Brant, Resource Options International, and the mighty middle market, visit www.goforroi.com. We look forward to having you join us for our next episode.